Those of you who are familiar with this channel have seen pretty much just one subject, the Bagua and the trigrams. I'm going to start a new series now. In general, I guess you could say this channel is devoted to symbolic systems. And if I'm given the opportunity to continue to post videos, there'll be a number of different systems discussed. I'd like to discuss this, what you see before you. A lot of people will think, oh, astrology. Some people will think, oh no, astrology. But I don't like the word astrology. I don't think it's the right word. Because astrology means the study of stars. So it's astros, the star, and logos, study of, the logic of. Also means word, so you can think of like the expression of the stars. So maybe there's something there. There is a form of chart reading called sidereal that is aligned to the stars, but that's not what this is. And when you take a look at a Western zodiac chart, more often than not, it's really not about the stars at all. What it's actually about is our solar system. There's only one star in our solar system, and it's represented in one particular point, right here. But then what is this thing here on the outside? What is this wheel with all the signs that they call constellations? That's where it gets confused. There's an objection, a reasonable objection the scientific community has against astrology, saying that, well, hey, the constellations don't line up with the signs anymore due to the precession of the equinoxes, because there's a tilt to the orbit of the Earth. I'm sorry, there's a tilt to the Earth rotation such that it wobbles. And as it wobbles, it takes, I can't remember exactly what it is, 1,000+ years to make a full wobble, you might say. And in the course of that time, the position of the constellations shifts to different dates within the year. So they say, well, you tell me that at this particular date, that's when you're entering this new sign, but that's not what's happening. And so what I say to that is, well, what you're doing is you're ignoring the context of what was happening in the ancient world. So the signs have really nothing to do with the stars. The stars are just a way of being able to tell where you are within the year. The signs are about a year. It's about an annual cycle. And that's what I'm going to focus on here. So let's just talk briefly about what this chart is representing, right? Because I realize that there's a good chance that I will lose people when I start discussing the details of this, because you start to use the language of the system that you're working with. And in the case of the trigrams, it's a language that's, well, unfamiliar to most people. So that's kind of a benefit because it's like a blank slate. And it's also incredibly simple because you're basically talking about solid and broken lines, and you're talking about 8 different possible symbols in 2 configurations. It's a very limited language. Here we're talking about something that corresponds to the configuration within our solar system. So you could think of this here as the horizon line. And then overhead is basically our side of the planet, what's in the sky over the side of the planet that you happen to be on at the moment of time of interest. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a birth chart. It could be any point in time. And then the other side, you have all this. Right? So here's your horizon line. And then these are the objects, right? So you got Jupiter, Ascendant, Venus, Mercury, Sun, Pluto, etc. They're all placed within this wheel, right? So let's simplify things here for a moment. I am going to get rid of all of the points in there, just so that we're only looking at what's in the wheel. And the wheel essentially is describing a life cycle. And I think that you will find that this is the basic pattern that we all go through to some extent. It begins, and actually what I can do here just to kind of line things up nicely. I'll put Aries here on the left. So now I'm going to start talking about signs, and that's going to make some people go, oy vey. But what else do you want me to call them? This is called Aries, right? Aries the ram. So why is it Aries? And what is the significance? Well, it happens in the spring. The significance is that at this moment right here is our vernal equinox. And we're going to progress from the vernal equinox, which is where it's equal day, equal night, right? Equal amount of time. So that has to do with the so-called position of the sun in the sky, the amount of time, and that's our placement within the year. So we're getting an orientation. We're getting an orientation of the natural life cycles. And the spring is quite often thought of as being the beginning of a new year. That is what the spring is, right? New things are coming into being, and that's basically what Aries is about. And we're going to go around. This is the progression of time through the annual cycle, which is itself a microcosm of a life cycle. And so it describes the potential stages within life. That's essentially what this is about. So I'm going to tell that story now. There's a number of different ways of telling it, and it kind of relies on a certain poetic sensibility. And the poetry that I'm going to use is primarily that of a plant and its seed. So when a plant has a seed that develops on it, that it creates, it really is not its own thing until the seed separates from the plant. And that's what Aries is about. So Aries is that moment where something new comes into being. Previously, it was just part of the plant, but now it's its own thing, and it's heading off in whatever direction it happens to be heading. It's sort of without thought, just charging forth into the unknown, carried by the winds, heading in a direction, and it doesn't really know why. So the word that I typically use to associate with Aries is spontaneity. And I have a number of terms that I kind of just use to refer to the domain of what we're talking about for each of the signs. So Aries is about spontaneity in the sense of spontaneously coming into being, and at the same time spontaneously heading off in whatever direction that it happens to want to go. A seed, in order to move on in a life cycle, in order for it to progress, has to find fertile soil. And that's what Taurus is about. Taurus is about stability, solid ground, right? It's only within solid ground that a seed can germinate, which is what Gemini is about, right? Gemini is an uncomfortable split within one thing. It's bound together, and yet it's split in two. What is the seed doing when it germinates? Well, part of it is reaching up towards the sun. Part of it is burrowing down into the ground. It's heading in opposite directions within itself. And this is incredibly important. This is really the source of everything. Because you have to notice that at any given point along the way in this whole ride around the wheel, it could be the end of the story, right? You could have a spontaneous thing that comes into being, it goes off in whatever direction it doesn't, it never finds solid ground, it never finds anything to land on, it never germinates. So, okay, in order for anything to really develop and grow, this is the most developmental, fundamental, it's like the fundamental engine of life. Cell division, in essence, you could say that's fundamentally what's being represented here. So it's that capacity to grow, to divide, and division and growth are inseparable concepts. When germination has been successfully achieved, then you have the potential for things to nurture, and there's like a give and take. So Cancer is that exchange, you could say gas exchanges for plants, right? Where the plant establishes itself on the basis of being able to derive nourishment from the soil and sunlight from above, and then it's offering its gases to its environment. So it's a symbiotic relationship with the environment. That's what Cancer is, and that's what builds the being until there is the formation of a self, that it has enough of a place in the world, that it has a sense of its own being. That's what Leo is about. So Leo is self-orientation, the dawning of self-awareness, the dawning of, I guess self-awareness might actually be a little bit later. It's really of the coming into the self. So it's not reflexive in that you're looking back at the self necessarily. It's more like you're looking out through the self. That there's enough that's been built here in Cancer so that there is a vessel for the self to really blossom in. It's almost like a flower, right? The self is the flower of the being that's in development. And when the self comes into being, within the being, then it has the capacity to look into its environment and to understand that environment to some extent, to analyze that environment, to sort it into different categories, and to organize it. And that's what Virgo's about. So Virgo is organizing and analyzing. That's how I summarize it. And so when there is a well-organized environment, the potential for balance, homeostasis, is within reach. So that's Libra, the scales, right? Finding balance is fundamentally what Libra is about, and it's between the individual being and its environment. This is also kind of another plateau here from which one can look beyond the self, because if you have not figured out how to achieve balance, it's very difficult to look beyond the self because you're still trying to figure out how to organize and maintain your own reality, right? And don't really have time to look beyond it. But if you are able to gain some kind of stability in the dynamic way, so it's a little different than this kind of solid ground, Taurian base rock, like foundation. It's more like you got a bunch of plates up in the air and you need to keep them spinning. Right? So if you can keep all these things spinning and you get a little bit extra time, it's sort of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, you get a little bit of free time to consider something beyond yourself. Well, what are you going to consider? Well, you're going to consider the other. And that's what Scorpio is. So Scorpio is fundamentally the awareness, appreciation, and understanding of the other. It's interesting, and I'll probably do a series on this at some point or another, but take a look at the difference between Virgo and Scorpio. And I'm talking about the symbol. Notice the difference between the symbols. Virgo is looking within. How do I get myself organized and together? Right? It's like in relation to the self, I'm looking out there, I'm dealing with all this stuff, and how does it apply to me? Right? This is going more like, oh, there's other, see, it's the arrow pointing outward. There's other things, and I'm looking at these other things, and I'm realizing, hey, they're also living beings, and they're also struggling to figure it out and survive and find their way in the world. That's Scorpio. It can be used many different ways, right? It can be used selfishly, that ability to perceive others, right? Or it can be used to appreciate the fact that, that we're not alone. When we appreciate others, when we appreciate, and I say other in the broadest sense, it's not just other human beings, it's other beings of all kinds, other creatures, and you could say that there is kind of a metaphysical other that wraps all of existence, all of our experience into one big bundle, because it's basically like this life is happening to us. And all the things happening out there are the other, and we are just us, right? It's just the self and the other. So it's the self trying to figure out, how do I deal with this environment, come into some balance with it. Oh, I realize this environment is made up of all these others who are, you know, in some respects like me, in the sense that they have sensing apparatus and they're making decisions and they're taking actions, right? It's not an inert world. It's not a billiard table. It's not the bumping particles, right, that are just obeying some set of rules. No, there are conscious beings out there making decisions, and I need to understand them if I'm going to understand the world, understand this creation. What am I living in? Sagittarius. That's what Sagittarius is. Sagittarius is the sage, developing understanding through the perception of the other. It's observation. Right? Observation not with the self as the primary concern, right? Because that's self-serving, and that kind of just heads back towards Leo. But this is observation with something else that's of primary concern. You're observing others to deepen your understanding so that you know what to do. You have a greater sense of what your place is. What is my role within this world? What am I here to do? That's what Capricorn is, right? And it's from understanding our responsibility. So we need to have understanding in order to pinpoint and get a fix on what our responsibility is here. When we do have a sense of what our responsibility is and we're able to fulfill it, we get a sense of how everything is interacting, playing its own role, dancing together, even when they're at odds with each other. So it's transcending the conflict of life, because you're recognizing that everyone has their prerogative, everyone has their point of view, everyone has their needs and their wants, and it's all interacting in one gigantic, messy dance. That's Aquarius, is seeing the big picture. And it's from that vantage point that we are able to relieve ourselves of ourselves to see that we were just here for our dance, and that there comes a time when the dance is over, and that by relinquishing our place, we allow for the space for something new to come into being. And that's the dance of life. It's the cycle. It's the whole wheel. And the potential is within each of us all the way through. But at some point, we may get stuck somewhere. A lot of people get stuck right here. Particularly in the age of the individual. So, this is the context for this symbolic system. I simply call it a natal chart. I do natal chart readings. I'm going to put a graphic on the screen when I edit this thing. If you're interested in getting a reading, it's like having a deep conversation about your life with someone who you've never met. It can be very interesting. It can be a little intense. You can control how far you want to go. And if you're interested in this and you don't have much money because no one has a job anymore, I will offer a cut rate discount to anyone who is willing to have their reading posted online so that people can share in the experience. You do not have to be identified. I can even change the quality of your voice if you would feel more comfortable if I did that sort of thing. So that's one of the things that I am attempting to do in order to keep myself afloat in this extremely uncertain world that we live in. I hope you found this interesting. I'm going to continue to develop this series. I'm also planning to continue with the trigram series. I have a lot of ideas that I'd like to share with you on that. And I actually have a number of other symbolic systems that I'd like to share on this channel. So I'm hoping to find some way of bringing in a little bit of income from these efforts because it takes a lot of time and energy to do so. And if you're being responsible, you have to have some way of being able to maintain your infrastructure, right? You also have to be able to keep all the plates spinning. You have to have some kind of stability, unless you're at this point here and you're ready to go. And I'm not there yet. I might get there soon, who knows? But I'm not there yet. I'm still trying to get some work done. I believe that I've done some observation and I've come to a degree of understanding, and it's my responsibility to share that with the whole wild world before I go. So that's why I'm doing this, and I hope you find it interesting. If you're not interested in getting a reading and you'd like to support the efforts, there are links in the description of the video, and maybe I'll even put it on the screen too. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for thinking. And please contact me if you have any questions.